Shalom, I'm Moriah Ben Abraham, and this is part 3 of the series, The Difference Between the Hebrew Mashiach and the Christian idea of a Messiah. If you have not yet joined this channel, please click subscribe below. Join our channel. Follow this playlist. Look at every part of this 7-part series and see clearly the difference between the Hebrew idea of a Mashiach and the Christian idea of a Messiah, or as they like to say with a sort of a English rendering of the Greek term Christos, Christ. So let's get into it. Today, in part 3, we're going to look at the fact that there's no expectation of a virgin birth in Hebrew thought. Most Christians assume the virgin birth was fulfilling a prophecy Jews were waiting for. However, the idea of a virgin birth, that's not found in the Torah, Nevi'im, that's in the prophets, or even in the Ketuvim, the writings. The primary source of this misunderstanding is the prophecy found in the book of Yeshayahu in chapter 7. The book of Matthew, that's a Greek textbook, part of the first book of what is called the New Testament, which some may argue was originally written in Hebrew, and that's a debate for another time. And again, let's just take it as we have it today. We're going to read from that book. We're going to read what they say. The book of Matityahu or Matthew purposefully mistranslates this verse of Yeshayahu to make the case that Jesus' birth was the fulfillment of a long-awaited prophecy. But let's look at what Matthew's translation says, and then let's look at the original Hebrew in the book of Yeshayahu, and let's sort it out. Let's start, therefore, with Matthew chapter 1 and verse 23. And again, we're going to use the New King James translation only because it's easily accessible, readily available. Many people have this translation and they trust in it. So let's stick with that translation, because regardless of what translation you may be using, it's all based on what was originally written in Greek, if it was in the Greek text, or originally written in Hebrew. And we're going to get to the bottom of the differences. So Matthew 1, verse 23, we read, "Behold, the virgin shall be with child and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel," which is translated, they say God with us in English. The Greek would have been theos, with us. Matthew is supposedly quoting the Hebrew text. All right, so let's read this now in Hebrew. It says here, "Lachen yiten Adonai hu lachem oath. Hine ha'alma ra v'yoledeth ben. V'karath shmo Immanuel." The Jewish Publication Society of 1985 translates this as, "Assuredly, my Lord," or my Master, Adonai, "will give you a sign of his own accord. Look, the young woman is with child and about to give birth to a son. Let her name him Emmanuel." Now, let's point out the differences here. Notice here that according to the JPS translation, the person having a child is a young woman, not a virgin. And this, my friends, is a big difference. If a virgin gives birth to a child, the birth itself has to be miraculous. Is this what Yeshayahu was writing about? A miraculous virgin birth? Or was he actually writing about a normal childbirth to a young woman and saying that that child's birth would be a sign? To really resolve this, let's first of all establish what the Hebrew term translated as young woman by the JPS translators and as virgin by the Greek text actually means. The Hebrew term that was used here is ha'alma, and it literally means a young woman. Let's look at Strong's lexicon, which provides an index. See, a lot of people use Strong's as if it's, let's say, authoritative definition, but it's really an index of how words were translated in the King James Version. And it provides definitions based on how it was variously translated. There are other tools that will give you much more insight into the actual root meaning of the words. But let's start, therefore, with what I might call the weakest of the ways of looking at the Hebrew definition of the word alma, which would be Strong's. So we're going to go to Strong's lexicon, and it says here in Strong's, alma, feminine word, a lass, as veiled or private, a damsel, maid, or virgin. So notice, it's been translated as virgin. But is that really correct? Is it correct to translate alma as virgin? As a second tool, let's look at Jeff Benner's Ancient Hebrew Lexicon, which gives the following definition. Alma, again, he says feminine, young maiden, a young female of marriageable age or newly married as at the prime age for work. The concept being used by Yeshayahu in chapter 7, verse 14, is that of a woman. The word itself simply isn't the Hebrew term used for virgin. The Hebrew term for virgin is Bethulah. If Yeshayahu intended to prophesy about a miraculous conception resulting in a virgin giving birth, he would have used the correct Hebrew term for virgin, which is Bethulah, a term he was well aware of and used in his writings. James Strong's lexicon shows Bethulah was translated by King James translators 38 times as virgin, including 5 times in the book of Yeshayahu. Strong's Concordance defines Bethulah as follows: feminine passive participle of an unused root meaning to separate, a virgin from her privacy, sometimes by continuation a bride, also figuratively a city or state, maid, virgin. Jeff Benner provides the following definition of Bethulah. He says, an unmarried young woman who is absolutely chaste. So the idea of virgin is Bethulah in Hebrew thought, not alma. Alma means young woman. Clearly, from the word choice alone, we can see that Yeshayahu did not intend to convey the idea of a virgin, that a virgin was going to give a birth. He wasn't trying to say that the sign that king was some miracle birth where a virgin who never had relations with a man suddenly gave birth. That wasn't the sign. Yeshayahu was inspired to use the word alma, meaning a young woman. And yet, the greater proof that Yeshayahu wasn't prophesying of a virgin birth comes not from just the word selection, but from the context of what Yeshayahu was writing. To grasp that, just take a few moments and read through the whole of chapter 7 and into chapter 8. Here are the key contextual points you should notice. To begin with, as the chapter opens, we see the children of Israel divided into 2 kingdoms. The kingdom of Yehuda, that's Judah, and the kingdom of Israel. The 2 kingdoms are at war with each other. We read here that the king of the northern kingdom of Israel had made a confederacy with the king of Aram, that is Syria. And together they marched on the southern kingdom of Yehuda to defeat it. These events terrified the king of Yehuda, Ahaz. And Yehovah sent Yeshayahu to Ahaz with a message and prophecy, letting him know that he was not going to allow the 2 northern kings to succeed in their attack against the kingdom of Yehuda. Yehovah sends Yeshayahu with his son, She'ar Yashuv, a name meaning a remnant shall return, to meet Ahaz and to tell him not to be afraid. He tells him the plot of the king of Israel and the king of Aram, and that they will not succeed. Moreover, Yehovah tells Yeshayahu to prophesy and say to the kingdom of Israel, led by the tribe of Ephraim, and hence referred to as Ephraim, will be destroyed within 65 years. We then read that Yehovah speaks further to Ahaz and tells him to ask for a sign. Ahaz says he won't test Yehovah by asking for a sign. But Yehovah responds and says, behold, I'm going to give you a sign anyway. And what is the sign for Achaz? The sign is the young woman conceiving and bearing a son and calling his Shem, that is his name, Immanuel, which means with us. Imanu means with us is El. El is with us. El is with us. But the sign, the prophecy, doesn't stop there. Yahweh continues speaking of the child who will be born, and he says, by the time he learns to reject the bad and choose the good, people will be feeding on curds and honey, for before the lad knows to reject the bad and choose the good, the ground whose two kings you dread shall be abandoned. What we just read above is critical to understanding this prophecy. This prophecy says a child will be born and be a sign to the king of Yehuda, who is Achaz, who reigned from 744 before the Common Era to 728 before the Common Era. Furthermore, this prophecy says that before the child is old enough to know the difference between sweet and sour, referred to here as curds and honey, or bad and good, the two kings of the north, Pekah, the king of Yisrael, and Rezin, the king of Aram, would be defeated and destroyed. So clearly, this prophecy could not be about a child who would be born some 700 years after the time of Achaz. The sign was for the king living at that time. The sign was for Achaz. The prophecy was about a sign for a living king at that time. It wasn't a sign of something future 700 years later. It was a sign of the impending doom on the two kings who had caused Achaz to tremble and fear. There is simply nothing, absolutely nothing in this chapter that would give anyone reading this prophecy the idea that a virgin 700 years after the death of Achaz would give birth to a son. It's just not there. This being the case, we have to ask, who then was the woman of the prophecy? Well, chapter 8 makes it abundantly clear. As the chapter opens, we read, quote, I was intimate with the prophetess, and she conceived and bore a son. And Yahweh said to me, name him Maher Shalal Hashbaz. This name for Yeshayahu's son was a message. It translates to swift is the booty, meaning the spoil. Speedy is prey, and conveys the thought that the destruction of Samaria and Damascus. Samaria, represented the northern kingdom of Israel, and Damascus represented Aram or Syria. In other words, the destruction of Israel and Syria was coming quickly. Then by verse 18, Yeshayahu says, here stand I and the children Yahweh has given me as signs and portents in Yisrael from Yahweh Tzivaot, Yahweh of hosts, who dwells on Mount Sion. Did you get that? All of Yeshayahu's children by his wife were signs for the nation of Yisrael. He said, here I stand, and the children Yahweh has given me as signs. All of Yeshayahu's children through his wife, who we call the prophetess, were signs for Yisrael. Yeshayahu, as chapter 7 opened, was sent with a son whose name was a sign for Yisrael. She'ar Yashuv, right? Then we read about the prophecy of a son to be named Immanuel, another sign for Yisrael. Again, in chapter 8, we see another son given a name that is a message and sign for Yisrael. Maher Shalal Hashbaz. All of Yeshayahu's sons had names that had a meaningful message for Yisrael at the time that Yeshayahu was living. The young woman of chapter 7 and verse 14 was Yeshayahu's wife, and their children, that is the children of Yeshayahu and his wife, were given to Yisrael for signs. prophets. This was always clear to all the people of Yisrael. There was never any thought or expectation anywhere in the Torah, the Nevi'im, or the Ketuvim, the Torah, the prophets, or the writings, of a virgin birth. We were never looking for a virgin to give birth. We're not looking for a virgin to give birth. That is not a prophecy or an expectation or a Hebrew thought at all. That has long been a thought found in Egyptian religion, in Greek religion, in mythology. But it's not a Hebrew thought. In Hebrew thought, there's only one Elohim. A Mashiach is a human being anointed to be king or priest, and there is no expectation of a virgin birth. Join us for part 4 in this series, where we're going to notice that there's no expectation in Hebrew thought of a Mashiach to die for our sins. Shalom, shalom.